The road to Camp Redwood Pines twisted through thick, looming trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mist. The air felt heavy, as if it held the weight of secrets long buried beneath the forest floor. Rachel Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as the narrow dirt path ahead became barely visible. It had been years since anyone had driven this road, and it showed. The deeper she ventured into the woods, the more the pines seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching over the road like dark arms. Ahead, the camp appeared, shrouded in a thin veil of fog. The buildings stood stark and half-renovated, caught between decay and revival. Moss clung stubbornly to the sides of cabins, and the faint scent of damp wood lingered in the air, mingling with something older, something musty, like the weight of time itself. Rachel's chest tightened as she parked her car in the empty lot, the silence around her unnerving. This place still felt forgotten. She stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply, the fresh scent of pine filling her lungs, masking her apprehension. This wasn't just a story for her. No. She was here for the truth. The camp's reopening was the perfect cover for her investigation into the unsolved murders that had haunted this place for nearly half a century. As a true crime journalist, she'd spent years obsessing over the brutal killings of 3 young girls in 1977. And now, with the camp set to welcome a new generation, she was determined to uncover what really happened. As Rachel closed her car door, a figure caught her eye. Near one of the cabins stood Jack Holloway, the camp's owner. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair that hinted at a man who had seen too much. He appeared deep in thought, supervising the final touches on a newly painted cabin, but there was something about the way he moved, rigid, almost mechanical, that made Rachel uneasy. She approached him cautiously. "Mr. Holloway," she called, extending her hand. Jack turned to face her, his expression cold, his eyes assessing her for a moment too long before he nodded. "Rachel Carter, the new counselor," he replied, his voice neutral but guarded. Rachel nodded. "Yes, though I'm also here to document the reopening for an article." She hesitated for a moment, deciding to test the waters. It must feel strange, reopening the camp after all these years, especially given the history. Jack's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "History is best left where it belongs. The past is in the past, Miss Carter. This camp is about new beginnings." Rachel forced a smile, but Jack's response sent a chill down her spine. His tone was clipped, his demeanor colder than the morning fog that surrounded them. She nodded politely and excused herself, already feeling the tension simmering beneath the surface. As she walked toward the counselor cabins, she caught a glimpse of the Kiowa campsite through the trees where the murders had taken place. The shadows of the pines seemed to linger longer there, and for a brief moment, Rachel felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. The cabin Rachel would be sharing with the other counselors was cozy but rustic, with wooden bunks lining the walls and a large window that looked out toward the forest. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by the sound of laughter. 2 women stood by the bunks, chatting excitedly. "Hey, you must be Rachel." A bubbly woman with curly blonde hair bounded over to her. "I'm Megan Harper. Welcome to Camp Redwood." Rachel smiled, feeling some of the tension ease. Megan's energy was infectious, her enthusiasm for the camp palpable. "Nice to meet you, Megan," Rachel said. "It's good to be here." Megan gestured to the other woman, who was sitting quietly on one of the lower bunks, sketching in a notebook. "And this is Cassie. She's one of the campers, but she's been here since early summer. Bit of an artist, as you can see." Cassie glanced up, her dark eyes locking onto Rachel's for a moment before she quickly looked away, returning to her sketching. She couldn't have been more than 14, with long black hair and a quiet, almost eerie presence about her. Rachel made a mental note to keep an eye on her. As the 3 of them settled into conversation, Megan brought up the camp's reopening. "It's so great that Jack decided to bring the camp back, you know? My mom used to work here before it closed. She always talked about how beautiful this place was, though she did mention the Whispering Pines legend." Rachel's ears perked up. "The Whispering Pines?" Megan grinned. "Yeah, it's just a silly story the kids used to tell. They'd swear they could hear voices in the trees at night, like the forest itself was talking. Probably just the wind, but it definitely creeped some people out." Rachel filed the information away, intrigued. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the camp grew still, Cassie approached her. Without saying a word, she handed Rachel a drawing. It was a rough sketch of the Kiowa campsite, but in the background, shadowy figures loomed between the trees, their shapes distorted and unnatural. Rachel blinked, unsettled. "What's this?" she asked, but Cassie didn't respond. She simply shrugged and walked away, leaving Rachel staring at the unsettling image. The next morning, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The camp was coming to life around her, children running, counselors prepping activities, but Rachel's thoughts were consumed by the Kiowa campsite. She had to see it for herself. Under the guise of exploring the grounds, Rachel made her way to the Kiowa site. The air grew colder as she approached, and an unsettling quiet settled over the area. The tents had been restored, but there was something wrong about the place, as if it resisted the renovations. The grass was overgrown in some spots, and the trees seemed to lean toward her, their branches brushing against one another in a low, constant murmur. Rachel crouched down to examine a patch of earth where the bodies had been found so many years ago. As she sifted through the dirt, her fingers brushed something cold and metallic. She pulled it free, an old, faded bracelet, half buried in the ground. Her breath caught. It had likely belonged to one of the victims. Startled, Rachel slipped the bracelet into her pocket, her heart pounding. She had come here for answers, and it seemed the camp was ready to give them to her, one chilling clue at a time. As she made her way back toward the main camp, something caught her attention. At the edge of the woods, she spotted a figure just standing there, watching her. Her pulse quickened. "Hello," she called out, but the figure slipped into the shadows before she could get a closer look. Shaken, Rachel hurried back to camp, her mind racing with questions. Later that day, Rachel found herself standing outside Jack Holloway's office, her hand raised to knock. She needed answers, and Jack was the only person who might have them. The office was small and cluttered, with old photos of the camp's glory days lining the walls. Jack sat behind his desk, his expression guarded as he watched her enter. "What can I do for you, Rachel?" Rachel wasted no time. "I visited the Kiowa campsite this morning. I found something, a bracelet, likely from one of the victims." Jack's face darkened. "You shouldn't be poking around there," he said, his tone sharp. "That part of the camp is best left alone." Rachel frowned. "It's part of the camp's history. People deserve to know what really happened." Jack stood abruptly, his eyes flashing with anger. "Some things are better left buried. You're here to help the camp, not dredge up old ghosts. Stay away from Kiowa." There was something in his voice, a threat, veiled in professionalism. Rachel's suspicions deepened. Jack wasn't just concerned about the camp's image, he was hiding something. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught sight of a file drawer, slightly ajar. Inside, she glimpsed a folder marked 1977 Incident, Confidential. Before she could react, Jack was at her side, slamming the drawer shut, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Don't go looking for trouble, Miss Carter." That night, the camp was quiet, but the stillness felt oppressive. Rachel lay in her bunk, her mind racing with everything she had learned. The wind howled through the trees outside, but it wasn't the wind that kept her awake. It was the faint whispers, just like Megan had mentioned. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the breeze, growing louder as the night deepened. Rachel's phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. She reached for it, expecting a message from one of the counselors, but when she opened the notification, her blood ran cold. It was an old black and white photo of the Kiowa campsite the night of the murders. She had never seen this photo before. Before she could react, a soft tapping came from the window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the sound. Outside, just beyond the circle of light cast by the cabin, stood a figure, barely visible in the shadows. Its form was hazy, dissolving into the trees as soon as she tried to focus. Rachel shot up in bed, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The figure was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at her. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. As the night wore on, Rachel stared out into the forest, the trees whispering in the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, the Hollow Man was watching. Waiting. The camp buzzed with activity the following morning. The sound of children laughing and the clatter of plates from the dining hall created a lively backdrop as the counselors prepared for the day. But Rachel noticed Megan Harper pacing nervously near the entrance to the cabin area, her face pinched with concern. Rachel approached her, sensing that something was wrong. "Everything okay?" she asked. Megan sighed, running a hand through her curly blonde hair. "It's just, I can't find Sammy. He didn't show up for breakfast, and I figured he might still be sleeping, but his bed hasn't been touched since last night. I've asked around, and no one's seen him." Rachel's investigative instincts flared. The memory of the cryptic photo from the night before was still fresh in her mind, along with the eerie whispers that had echoed through the trees. "Did he say anything strange last night? Seem upset?" Megan shook her head. "No, nothing. He was his usual self." She paused, biting her lip. "Do you think we should be worried?" Rachel didn't answer right away, but a chill crept up her spine. Something felt off. "We should organize a search party, just in case," she said. "Maybe he wandered off." Within minutes, the counselors were spread out across the campgrounds, calling Sammy's name and scanning the woods. Rachel joined the group heading toward the forest's edge, her heart pounding harder with every step she took. The deeper they ventured into the trees, the quieter the world around them became, the joyful sounds of the camp fading into a tense silence. Rachel combed the area carefully, her eyes sweeping over the ground for any sign of movement. As she moved through the underbrush, she noticed small, unsettling details, broken branches, odd symbols scratched into the bark of trees, and the ever-present sensation of being watched. It was as though the forest itself was hiding something. Hours passed, and still no sign of Sammy. The tension among the counselors grew with every minute, and Rachel could see the panic beginning to rise in Megan's eyes. Jack Holloway soon appeared, his face stony as he tried to maintain control over the situation. "Everyone calm down," Jack urged, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "He probably just wandered off and got lost. We'll find him." Rachel wasn't so sure. As Jack tried to reassure the others, her gaze drifted toward the shadowy depths of the forest. Something was wrong here, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Sammy's disappearance was only the beginning. Still shaken by the mysterious message from the previous night, Rachel decided to use the search as an excuse to investigate deeper into the woods. The nagging feeling that something lay hidden within the trees gnawed at her, and she found herself drawn once again toward the Kiowa campsite. The place seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite explain, as though the past was desperately trying to claw its way to the surface. Rachel moved carefully, her eyes scanning the area. She noticed a narrow path leading away from the main campsite, hidden beneath the overgrown brush. It wasn't marked on any of the camp's maps, and something about it felt wrong. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she followed it deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and more twisted as she ventured farther from the camp. At the end of the path, she stumbled upon an old, overgrown well, half hidden beneath a blanket of moss and tangled vines. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Rachel's heart raced as she approached it, the dark mouth of the well yawning open before her like an ancient secret, waiting to be discovered. Peering into the well, Rachel's breath caught when she saw something glinting in the darkness below. She knelt by the edge, lowering herself cautiously until her fingers brushed against the object. It was a piece of tattered fabric, soaked through with dirt and mold. As she lifted it into the light, she realized it was clothing, likely from the time of the original murders. A chill crawled up her spine. There was no doubt in her mind someone had hidden this long ago, and for good reason. Whatever secrets the well held, they were deeply connected to the horrors that had taken place here so many years ago. Determined to learn more, Rachel stuffed the fabric into her bag and began making her way back to camp. But as she approached the tree line, she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing just a few yards away was Eli Whittaker. He was watching her from the shadows, his expression cold, his eyes dark with silent warning. Before Rachel could call out to him, he turned and disappeared into the forest without a word, leaving Rachel with a growing sense of dread. That night, sleep was impossible. The eerie presence of the well, the weight of the tattered fabric in her bag, and Eli's silent warning gnawed at Rachel's mind. She tossed and turned in her bunk, the soft creaking of the old wood cabin the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The whispers outside, the ones Megan had mentioned, seemed louder tonight, closer, almost as if they were trying to speak directly to her. Unable to stand it any longer, Rachel quietly slipped out of bed and grabbed her jacket. If anyone had answers, it would be Eli. She needed to know what he was hiding. The forest was dark and oppressive, but Rachel followed the faint trail that led to the Whittaker cabin, a crumbling structure nestled deep in the woods. The air was thick with tension as she approached, the moon barely casting enough light to guide her through the trees. Eli was waiting for her, sitting on the porch of the cabin as though he had known she would come. His gaunt figure was intimidating in the moonlight, but there was something tired about him, an air of resignation that made him seem far older than his years. "I figured you'd come," Eli said, his voice low and rough. "You've seen the well." Rachel took a cautious step forward, her eyes narrowing. "What is it? What happened out there?" Eli let out a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond the cabin. "That well is more than just a relic. It was used by my ancestors, for rituals. Sacrifices." Rachel's stomach turned. "Sacrifices?" Eli nodded. "The Hollow Man," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "An old spirit, tied to the land. The forest needs blood to stay quiet. When the camp reopened, the hunger came back. The murders, those girls, they weren't random. They were chosen." Rachel felt her heart race. The murders were sacrifices. And now that the camp's open again, the killings will start again, Eli finished for her. "Sammy isn't the first. And he won't be the last." Rachel's blood ran cold. "How do I stop it?" Eli's gaze darkened. "You can't. The Hollow Man already has his next mark." Rachel didn't wait until morning. Armed with her discovery, she stormed into Jack Holloway's office the next day, her heart pounding with anger and fear. The room was cluttered with old files and photos, and Jack was behind his desk, reviewing papers when she barged in. "We need to talk," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. Jack glanced up, his expression hardening. "I'm busy." "I found the well," Rachel pressed, undeterred. "I found evidence that proves those murders were part of some ritual. There's something dark in these woods, and you know about it." Jack stiffened, his face paling. "What you found are relics of old stories meant to scare kids, nothing more. Stop looking for ghosts that don't exist." But Rachel wasn't buying it. "You were here, Jack. The night the girls were killed. You were part of it, whether you like it or not." Jack's mask cracked. For a brief moment, Rachel saw something, guilt, maybe fear, flash in his eyes. "I was a child. I didn't know," he stopped himself, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Rachel's gaze swept the room, and her eyes landed on a file drawer, partially open. Without thinking, she stepped forward and grabbed one of the folders inside. Jack lunged toward her, but it was too late. Inside the folder were witness testimonies and cryptic notes. "The Chosen," Rachel read aloud, her heart sinking. And at the bottom of the report, Jack's father's name. Jack slammed the folder shut, his face twisted with anger. "Leave it alone, Rachel. Before you get hurt." That night, a heavy tension hung over the camp. The counselors were quiet, the children restless, and the whispers in the trees seemed louder than ever, as if the forest was coming alive. Rachel lay in her bunk, her mind racing with everything Eli and Jack had revealed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Her nightmares were filled with images of shadowy figures and the dark, gaping mouth of the well. In the middle of the night, she was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. She sat up, her pulse racing, and saw Megan burst into the cabin, her face pale as a sheet. "Cass is missing," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "She's gone." Panic erupted as the counselors searched the campgrounds again, but deep down, Rachel knew. This was no ordinary disappearance. The Hollow Man was claiming his victims, one by one. Desperate, Rachel confronted Jack once more, telling him everything Eli had revealed. But Jack snapped, his calm demeanor breaking. "You need to stop," he hissed, his eyes wild. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Rachel's heart sank. She realized, in that moment, that Jack knew exactly what was happening. And worse, he was part of it. As the night dragged on, the whispers grew louder, filling the camp with an oppressive sense of dread. The forest had claimed another victim. And Rachel knew it wouldn't stop there. The morning sun was no comfort. The camp was in chaos, and whispers of Cass's disappearance spread like wildfire. Counselors huddled together, their voices low but frantic, while campers remained confused and scared, sensing that something was horribly wrong. Rachel stood near the dining hall, watching as Jack Holloway barked orders, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "We'll find her," Jack said, his voice strained but trying to remain authoritative. "No one's leaving camp. The kids need to be reassured, not frightened." But it was too late for that. Rachel could see the fear in the other counselors' eyes, especially Megan, who was pacing back and forth, her face pale. Rachel had tried to sleep the night before, but the eerie whispers from the woods had kept her awake, along with the memory of the video she'd received, the one showing shadowy figures at the scene of the original murders. Now, with Cassie missing, she couldn't shake the feeling that the camp was on the verge of something terrible. "Megan," Rachel said, pulling her aside. "I think something's going on with Jack. He's too quick to brush all this off, just like with Sammy. He knows more than he's letting on." Megan's eyes widened. "You don't really think Jack would?" "I don't know what to think," Rachel interrupted. "But I've been finding things. Old things. Evidence that ties back to the murders. And now these disappearances, they're not random. I think it's connected to the camp's past, and Jack is hiding something." Megan looked away, her hands trembling. "I don't want to believe that. But something about this place has felt wrong since we got here. Help me search again," Rachel urged. "This time, we need to look where Jack might not want us to. There's something in these woods, something he doesn't want us to find." Reluctantly, Megan nodded, though fear still clouded her eyes. As the two of them prepared to head out, the wind picked up, and the whispers, those faint, unsettling voices, grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line, beckoning them deeper into the forest. Rachel's skin prickled. Whatever was out there, it was watching. Rachel and Megan trudged back toward the Kiowa campsite, the site of the original murders, where Rachel had first felt the camp's dark history pressing in on her. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and the trees seemed to loom overhead, casting long, menacing shadows. "We shouldn't be out here," Megan whispered, her voice shaking. "It feels wrong." Rachel didn't respond. Her focus was on finding anything that could explain what was happening. As they reached the campsite, Rachel's eyes scanned the ground, searching for clues. That's when she saw it. Half buried near the base of a tree was a rusted locket, its delicate chain tangled in the roots. Rachel knelt down, carefully prying it free. The locket was old, covered in strange, intricate symbols, similar to the ones she had seen scratched into the trees near the well. She wiped away the dirt and opened it. Inside, there were initials engraved, ones that matched one of the original victims. "This belonged to one of the girls," Rachel whispered, her heart pounding. Megan stepped back, her face pale. "Rachel, let's just go back. We've found enough." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. As she held the locket, it suddenly grew warm in her hand. And then, without warning, she heard it, a faint voice calling her name, drifting on the wind. Rachel froze. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods. Megan grabbed her arm. "It's just the wind, Rachel. We need to leave." But Rachel knew it wasn't the wind. The voice was real. And as the locket pulsed with warmth, an image flashed in her mind, 3 girls running through the woods, their faces twisted in terror, chased by a shadowy figure. The vision was so vivid, so overwhelming, that Rachel stumbled back, dropping the locket in shock. "What's happening to me?" Rachel muttered, shaken to her core. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was showing her what had happened all those years ago. And the more she saw, the more she could feel the Hollow Man's presence closing in. Rachel knew there was only one person who could give her the answers she needed. Rachel ventured back into the woods alone, her steps hurried but purposeful. She needed to find Eli Whittaker, the only one who had spoken truthfully about the dark force that haunted the camp. The twisted branches above seemed to guide her as she moved deeper into the forest, the trees themselves bending toward her, as if leading her to her destination. The Whittaker cabin came into view, its crumbling walls barely visible through the dense undergrowth. Eli was standing at the edge of the forest, waiting for her. His figure was gaunt and hollow, his eyes shadowed with fear. This time, there was no hesitation. He spoke before Rachel even had the chance to ask. "You've seen him, haven't you?" "The Hollow Man," Eli said, his voice a rasping whisper. Rachel nodded, her heart racing. "What is he? What does he want?" Eli took a deep breath. "He's an ancient spirit, older than any of us. He's tied to this land, a force that demands blood to remain dormant. My family, we were bound to him generations ago. The Whittakers were tasked with keeping him satisfied, through sacrifices." Rachel's stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. The girls in 1977, they were sacrifices. Eli's eyes darkened. Yes. When the camp opened, the forest grew restless. The Hollow Man's hunger returned. My family had no choice. We were forced to offer those girls, to keep the Hollow Man at bay. Jack's father, he was part of it too. Rachel's breath caught. And Jack? Eli hesitated. Jack was a child, but he played a part. He didn't know, not fully. But he helped lure the girls into the woods. He's been living with that guilt ever since. Rachel's head spun as she processed Eli's words. The camp, the murders, the disappearances, it was all tied to an ancient, malevolent force that had been feeding off the land for centuries. And now, with the camp reopened, the Hollow Man had awakened again. "How do we stop it?" Rachel asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Eli's expression was grim. "There's only one way to break the cycle. Someone connected to the original murders has to offer themselves as the final sacrifice. That's the only way to end it." Rachel's blood turned to ice. "But, that means..." Eli nodded. "He's already marked his next victim. It's not the campers, Rachel. It's you." The walk back to camp felt surreal, the weight of Eli's warning pressing down on Rachel like a suffocating blanket. She now knew the truth. The Hollow Man wasn't just a spirit, he was a force of nature, tied to the land and the blood spilled on it. And she was next. Rachel's mind raced as she pieced together the events of the last few days. Jack's reluctance to confront the camp's past, his suspicious behavior, and now Eli's confession. Jack had been involved all along, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The guilt of his role in the murders had been eating away at him for years, but instead of facing it, he'd reopened the camp, knowing full well the danger it posed. Rachel stormed into Jack's office, her heart pounding with anger. Jack looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. "You knew," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "You knew what would happen if the camp reopened. You knew the Hollow Man would come back, and you did it anyway." Jack's face paled. "I didn't." "Don't lie to me," Rachel snapped. "Eli told me everything. You were part of it, Jack. You helped lure those girls into the woods. You reopened the camp, knowing the risks. How many more people have to die before you stop this?" Jack's hands trembled as he stood, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. I thought we could contain it. I thought if we followed the rules, the Hollow Man wouldn't." "There are no rules, Jack," Rachel interrupted. "This thing doesn't care about your guilt or your excuses. It's going to keep killing until it's satisfied." Jack collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." Rachel stared at him, disgusted by his cowardice. "Then why didn't you stop it?" Jack didn't answer, and Rachel turned on her heel, storming out of the office. As she stepped outside, the whispers returned, louder than before, swirling around her like a dark wind. The forest pulsed with energy, and Rachel knew time was running out. Night had fallen, and the camp had descended into a state of quiet terror. The remaining counselors were on edge, their eyes darting toward the forest as if they could feel the darkness creeping closer. Shadowy figures flickered just beyond the cabins, and Rachel could sense the Hollow Man drawing nearer. Megan found her near the edge of the forest, her face pale and her voice shaking. "We need to leave, Rachel. We need to get out of here." Rachel wanted to agree, but Eli's words echoed in her mind. The Hollow Man had marked her, and he wouldn't stop until he claimed her. Before she could respond, the sky darkened, and a storm rolled in, the wind whipping through the trees with a violent fury. The forest seemed to come alive, the branches swaying and snapping in the wind. The whispers turned into screams, and Rachel knew the Hollow Man was here. Desperate, Rachel faced an impossible choice. She could flee, try to escape the camp and hope the Hollow Man would stop. Or she could stay, offer herself as the final sacrifice, and end the curse once and for all. As the darkness closed in around her, Rachel took a deep breath. The Hollow Man's voice was clear now, whispering her name, beckoning her deeper into the woods. She knew what she had to do. With one final glance at the camp, Rachel stepped forward, disappearing into the forest, ready to face the terror that awaited her. Rachel stood at the edge of the forest, her body trembling in the cold night air. The whispers she had been hearing for days were louder now, almost like they were inside her head, pulling her deeper into the woods. She knew there was no turning back. The Hollow Man had marked her, and if she didn't confront him, more people would die. Gripping her flashlight tightly, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving the safety of the camp behind. The moment she crossed into the trees, the air changed. It grew colder, thicker, and more oppressive. The ground felt soft beneath her feet, as if the forest floor itself was sinking beneath her weight. Every sound was magnified, the rustling of leaves, the snap of branches, but the whispers remained the loudest, growing more insistent as she ventured deeper. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees twisted into strange shapes, their branches curling like claws, and the path beneath her feet faded into the undergrowth. Rachel's sense of direction dissolved as the forest seemed to swallow her whole. She stumbled upon a series of stone markers, half buried beneath the moss and earth, their surfaces etched with symbols she recognized from the well and the locket. These were the remnants of the rituals the Whittakers had performed for the Hollow Man. The stones pulsed with a faint, sickly energy that sent a chill down her spine. She was crossing into forbidden territory now, places where terrible things had happened. The voices in the wind grew louder, clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were children's voices, filled with laughter and pain, mixed with faint screams that echoed through the darkness. Rachel's steps faltered, her heart pounding in her chest. But she couldn't turn back now. She knew she was close. Rachel didn't know how long she had been walking, but when she reached the hollow glen, the heart of the forest, she knew she had found the place where everything had gone wrong. The trees here were ancient, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The ground was soft and damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. A deep sense of dread washed over her as she stepped into the clearing. This was where the rituals had been carried out, the place where the girls had been taken, sacrificed to appease the forest's hunger. The shadows around her seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and shifting as if alive. And the whispers had grown into a deafening chorus of voices, filling the air with their torment. In the center of the glen stood a stone altar, old and worn, its surface stained with dried blood. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. Surrounding the altar were the remains of those who had been claimed by the forest, personal belongings, like the bracelet and the locket she had found earlier. Items left behind by the victims, now decayed and forgotten. As Rachel's fingers brushed the cold stone of the altar, she was hit with another vision. The world around her blurred, and suddenly, she wasn't alone. She saw the three girls from 1977, their faces twisted in fear, running through the woods. Shadowy figures pursued them, dragging them to this very spot. At the edge of the glen, Rachel saw a young Jack, standing frozen with horror, unable to move as the girls were sacrificed before his eyes. The truth was undeniable now. Jack hadn't just been a witness to the murders, he had been used, manipulated by the Whittakers to lure the girls here. And now, the camp's reopening had reignited the curse. The Hollow Man had returned, and he was hungry for more. The vision faded, leaving Rachel trembling. The camp had never been free from the curse. And now, standing in the center of the Hollow Man's domain, she realized there was no escape. The atmosphere in the glen grew impossibly heavy. The air around Rachel seemed to vibrate with energy, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure began to take shape. It was the Hollow Man. He was not fully human, his form was tall and twisted, a creature of darkness with glowing, hollow eyes that burned with an unnatural light. His presence was suffocating, and as he stepped closer, the temperature dropped, the air turning frigid and biting. Rachel could barely move, frozen in place by the sheer force of his malevolent power. When the Hollow Man spoke, his voice was not his own. It was a chorus of voices, the voices of the girls who had died in 1977, layered with the voices of the campers who had disappeared this summer. His words sent a wave of terror through her. "The forest's hunger can never be sated," he whispered, his voice like ice in her veins. "The blood it demands will never stop flowing. You are part of its cycle now." Rachel's chest tightened. The weight of the curse, the guilt of Jack's family, and the rituals, it all fell on her shoulders. She had become part of the forest story, bound to the same fate as the girls who had come before her. She realized, with growing horror, that the Hollow Man wasn't just after revenge. He was bound to the land, tied to the very fabric of the forest. As long as the camp remained open, as long as blood was spilled on its soil, the Hollow Man would continue to claim lives. There was no end to the curse, only temporary reprieves. Rachel gripped the locket, feeling the energy of the past victims coursing through her. She couldn't let it end like this. There had to be another way. Just as Rachel prepared to make her stand against the Hollow Man, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, her heart racing, and saw Jack Holloway emerging from the shadows of the forest. His face was pale, his eyes wild with fear and desperation. He had been following her. "Jack," Rachel gasped, "what are you doing here?" Jack's expression twisted with guilt. "I had to come. I thought I could stop it. I thought I could control him." Rachel's stomach turned. "Control him? What are you talking about?" Jack's hands trembled as he stepped closer. "The Whittakers told me there was a way to break the curse. They said if I offered a new sacrifice, I could end it for good." Rachel's blood ran cold as Jack's words sank in. You were planning to sacrifice me?" Jack's face contorted with shame. "I didn't have a choice. The camp, it's been my whole life. I thought if I could just give him what he wanted, it would all be over." The realization hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. Jack had used her, manipulating her obsession with the murders to lead her straight to the Hollow Man. He had believed that by offering her someone connected to the truth, he could end the curse permanently. But he had underestimated the Hollow Man's power. "You're a coward," Rachel spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You thought you could control something this powerful?" Jack's eyes filled with terror. "It's too late. I can't stop him." The Hollow Man began to close in, his hollow eyes burning with the promise of death. The forest seemed to pulse with dark energy, the trees bending and twisting as if alive. Rachel knew that Jack had sealed her fate. But she wasn't willing to go down without a fight. With no other choice left, Rachel braced herself, feeling the cold presence of the Hollow Man closing in around her. She had one last chance, one last desperate attempt to stop the killings. She gripped the locket, her fingers trembling as she called upon the energy of the past victims. She could feel their spirits, their pain and fear, swirling around her. For a brief moment, the Hollow Man hesitated, his form flickering as if caught between two worlds. Rachel could feel his power wavering. But it wasn't enough. The forest's hunger was too great, the power of the curse too strong. Rachel felt the pull of the altar, the weight of the curse dragging her down, forcing her to her knees. In a moment of cowardice, Jack tried to flee the glen, his footsteps frantic as he ran toward the trees. But the forest turned against him. The trees twisted and bent, their branches reaching out like claws, wrapping around Jack and pulling him back into the shadows. His screams filled the air as the forest claimed him, his body disappearing into the darkness, an offering to the Hollow Man. Rachel watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that her time was running out. The Hollow Man stood over her now, his hollow eyes fixed on her. The forest had grown silent, waiting for the final act of violence to unfold. With one last breath, Rachel closed her eyes, preparing to face the darkness. The shadows of the forest pressed down on Rachel as she stood in the heart of the hollow glen, facing the towering figure of the hollow man. His eyes glowed, empty and cold, as the trees around her seemed to bend toward him in reverence. The weight of the curse pressed into her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The whispers were now a cacophony, each voice crying out for more blood. Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the locket and the bracelet, symbols of the victims who had been lost to the forest's hunger. She had hoped, desperately, that the spirits of those girls could help her fight back. She closed her eyes and listened, trying to summon them. Their voices echoed in her ears, and for a moment, it felt like justice was within her grasp. But as the hollow man stepped forward, his form flickered only briefly before regaining strength. The forest demanded more than the past could give. Rachel realized, with crushing clarity, that Eli Whitaker's warning had been true all along. The forest would never stop unless it was given a final sacrifice, one willing to end the cycle of blood. She had to make a choice: sacrifice herself to save the others or fight and risk even more lives being taken. Her heart pounded as the hollow man moved closer, shadows swirling around her legs like vines. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of it filled her with dread. Could she really give herself to the forest? Rachel took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The forest fell deathly silent as she made her decision. The world shifted around her, and Rachel felt the cold fingers of another vision taking hold. She was no longer standing in the hollow glen but was pulled back in time to the night of 1977. She saw the three girls, Laurie, Michelle, and Doris, running through the dense trees, their faces twisted in terror as they fled the figures chasing them. Their breaths came in panicked gasps, and their fear was palpable. Behind them, dark shapes followed, relentless and hungry. The girls didn't stand a chance. Rachel saw a young Jack Holloway standing at the edge of the trees, his face pale as he watched helplessly, manipulated by the Whitakers. He wanted to help, but fear and confusion kept him rooted in place. Rachel felt every emotion as if it were her own: the terror, the desperation, the betrayal. She saw the moment the girls were dragged to the altar in the hollow glen, where their lives were brutally ended in the name of the forest's curse. Their blood stained the stones, and the hollow man emerged from the shadows to claim them. Rachel screamed, trying to stop it, but she was powerless to change the past. The vision twisted, and she saw the forest itself shuddering, its hunger satisfied only temporarily. As the vision faded, she was back in the present, standing face to face with the hollow man. She now understood the full weight of the curse. The forest was not just haunted by the past, it was alive, its hunger insatiable. The cycle would continue, repeating forever, unless someone willingly offered themselves as a final sacrifice. She knew what she had to do. Rachel's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, the cold metal pressing into her skin. She had made her choice, but before she allowed herself to be taken, she needed to tell the world what had happened. She couldn't let this place claim more innocent lives without exposing the truth. With trembling fingers, she began recording her final message. Her voice was shaky, but her determination shone through. "If you're hearing this," Rachel began, her breath fogging the night air, "then you need to understand that Camp Redwood Pines is cursed. The murders, the disappearances, they're not accidents. The camp is tied to something ancient and evil. The Whitakers, Jack, they were part of it. And now, it's happening again." She paused, glancing up at the hollow man as he moved closer, his glowing eyes fixed on her. The forest around her seemed to pulse with darkness, but she refused to stop. Jack was manipulated, she continued, used by his family to lure those girls to their deaths. The hollow man, is tied to the land. He demands blood, and he won't stop. Please, don't let this place reopen. The camp needs to be left to rot. Don't let anyone else fall into this trap. The shadows swirled closer, and Rachel knew she had little time left. She took a deep breath, her voice soft but firm as she made her final plea. "Tell my story. Stop the camp." As she hit send on the message, the hollow man's cold hand reached out for her. Her phone fell to the ground, its screen flickering as the shadows consumed her. The hollow glen was silent now, the echoes of Rachel's last words lost to the wind. The hollow man stood over her still body, his presence dark and oppressive. The forest seemed to breathe in unison with him, the trees groaning as they bent toward him in submission. His hunger was sated, for now. Slowly, the hollow man faded back into the shadows, his form dissolving into the darkness of the forest. The trees, once twisted and violent, settled into stillness. The whispers that had haunted the camp for days died down, leaving an eerie quiet in their wake. Rachel's phone lay abandoned on the forest floor, her final message sent but unseen. The curse had claimed another life, and the hollow man had been appeased, for now. But the peace would not last. The forest's hunger was eternal, and it would only be a matter of time before it demanded more blood. As the wind rustled the leaves, a cold chill swept through the air. The camera on Rachel's phone continued to record the empty glen, capturing the stillness that followed the violence. But the screen flickered once more before going dark, leaving only the haunting quiet behind. Days later, the authorities arrived at Camp Redwood Pines after being alerted to the disappearances. They combed the campgrounds, searching the cabins, the woods, and the hollow glen. But they found nothing. No bodies, no sign of the missing campers, and no trace of Rachel. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Once again, the camp was abandoned, left to decay under the weight of its dark history. The buildings stood empty, overgrown with moss and vines, their windows shattered by the passage of time. The silence of the forest seemed to stretch on forever. But the curse was not forgotten. In the final scene, a local real estate agent strolled through the empty camp, accompanied by a potential buyer. They discussed plans to redevelop the land, perhaps reopening the camp or turning it into something new. "People love a good urban legend," the agent said with a dismissive wave. "The stories of the murders are just that, stories. Perfect for bringing in a crowd." The potential buyer seemed intrigued, eager to breathe new life into the abandoned campgrounds. As they walked away, the camera lingered on the forest, the trees standing tall and dark in the distance. The shadows beneath their branches seemed to shift, as if something watched from within. The faintest sound of whispers drifted on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. The hollow man was waiting, watching from the shadows, ready for the next group of unsuspecting souls to arrive. In the stillness of the forest, the trees whispered their ancient promise: 3 will die. And this time, they would never stop counting.